The idea behind these sessions is as I go through the new or the renewed, as they call it, Ofsted framework. What I thought we'd do is we'd just spend a little bit of time looking at the previous one. The reason for that is for you to kind of see the differences between the old one and the new one. We'll have a look at some of the key documents. We won't pull them up, but I'll circulate the slides afterwards, and there's some links in the documents there as well. We'll have a little bit of talk about what those three documents are and how we can use them. We'll then have a look at the new framework and identify the differences between the old one and the new one. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about what an inspection may well look like when we get the call. Okay, and then we'll go into the judgments in a little bit more detail. So this is the old framework where they would examine quality of education on the left there. Then you would have behaviour and attitudes, personal development, and leadership and management. And all of that would culminate into one grade, one, sort of 1 or 2 word grade that you would get as an organization, ranging from outstanding, which is the top, to good, requires improvement, and inadequate. Ofsted in the new framework are trying to be a lot more transparent with education providers that they're inspecting, and this goes with the amount of information that they're releasing to us and webinars that they're putting on, and their YouTube channel is quite now populated with a lot of good resources as well. There's 3 key documents that we need to be aware of. On the left, we've got the FE and Skills Inspection Toolkit, which is the one that we'll be inspected under as a higher education institution. The other 2 documents in the middle, the FE and Skills Operating Guide for Inspectors, and the one on the right, the Inspection Information for FE and Skills Providers. These are 2 documents that we've never seen before. They've never given us the Bible, so to speak, or the manual or the handbook that they give inspectors to look at, and when they inspect, what they use to make these judgments and kind of some of the intricacies. So, and then the right document there is a work in development where it's going to be sort of an information page/website where there's going to be case studies of different organizations that have done particularly well in a certain area, and that goes on to the grades and things that we're going to talk about in just a moment. So the new inspection framework does look different, and you'll probably notice it looks a whole lot more colourful than the previous one. I think probably the key differences that colleagues have been able to see already is that the categories have got a little bit more, that instead of just those 4 categories, there's now, what is the 5, 6, the 7 categories, so a few more. The judgments have expanded as well, where they've got a key judgment around inclusion, they've got a judgment around contribution to the skills needs, but still we're seeing the same kind of judgments in terms of sort of the curriculum, teaching and training, achievements in there, and participation and development kind of replaces those behaviours and values that we've seen previously. And probably the big change really is how they sort of grade it on a 5-point scale, where gone are the days when you would get a 1 or 2 word grade that would summarize your provision. We'll now get a multitude of different grades on this. So if you like, it's kind of like a rubric. The obvious one there is safeguarding, is that it's a very binary judgment, that it's either met or not met, and that's a whole provider judgment. The judgments are split as well between whole provider and per programme. So whole provider is the judgments across the safeguarding, inclusion, leadership and governance, and contributing to the skill needs that we'd get as an institution. And then the per programme is almost, it should really be worded as per provision, because what we'll do in this is that we'll actually get 6 judgments in this. We'll get 3 for apprenticeships as a whole, rather than just per programme. It's as a whole, as our whole apprenticeship provision. But because we also have skills boot camps, you would get a judgment based on your skill boot camp provision, which would sit separately from apprenticeships. And then the big difference there, obviously, is the way that they grade it, is that it goes from sort of urgent improvement, needs attention, expected standard, strong standard, and exceptional. Their starting position is that where you're at expected standard, and then move up to strong standard, or when down on needs attention, trying to move back up to strong standard, and we'd get a judgment for each of those. We're not able to draw any conclusions, and Ofsted have been super clear about this, that we can't say that good would equal expected standard. Then it would be unwise of us to think that way, because they're 2 completely different frameworks. And they've made it super clear that expected standard is a really good achievement. It means that you are, providing a good quality education. through all of those domains. The one on the blue is the exceptional standard, which is going to be super, super hard to achieve. Those that achieve exceptional will be used as case studies on that sort of resource and website that I mentioned later on here. So we could expect to see much less people getting exceptional, but those people as getting exceptional will be used as an example of good practice in practice sharing across the provision. So what's it going to look like, and what are the differences in terms of the day-to-day practicalities of when we get the call? First of all, the cycle has shortened. So previously it used to be inspections on a 5-year cycle. It's now moved to 4. We get a bit more notice. We get 5 to 6 days notice, working days. And that goes to our nominee, who's Professor John Craig, the Pro Vice Chancellor for Education. Following that, there's a series of planning calls that happens between the nominee, various leaders in the university, and the chief inspector as well. And those can take a couple of weeks. So 5 to 6 days notice plus a week or so, where they'll start to target things about what they want to look at. The type of inspection stays, in which they will get a standard inspection, which is on that sort of 4-year cycle, and then you get monitoring visits. The same ethos is here, that if you fall foul of that expected standard, you'd have a monitoring visit, and it would just be on that particular bit where you're expected to demonstrate your progress towards expected standard. The difference is that they place a lot more emphasis on us being able to self-assess where we think we're strong and where we think that we need to improve. Inspections should be proportionate, so we'd probably expect maybe 1 to 2 inspectors per standard. So we'd expect somewhere, probably around 10 to 12 on site at any time. They'll still do the lesson visits, so they'll still observe colleagues teaching, which adds the importance that everybody needs to be aware of who the apprentices are in the room. And they'll still do things called learning walks, which kind of replace deep dives a little bit. Where deep dives looked at the full programme, learning walks will follow the journey of an apprentice in terms of their start points, their sort of midpoints and their end points. And a significant difference comes in the sample that they take, comes from our knowledge of those who carry specific learning differences or disabilities, or have things like additional considerations. And a key thread running through all of these is inclusion. And the strapline from Ofsted at the moment is that if we can get it right for the most disadvantaged learner, we can get it right for everybody, which is why their emphasis first and foremost looks at those with disabilities or SEND in our provision. And they'll, of course, still do the triangulation. They'll start with discussions of us, and then they'll triangulate that with employers and see how that's landing with employers. And then finally, after everything, they'll then triangulate it of how it's working on the shop floor or on the ground with the apprentices. So in terms of the judgments, what I've tried to do is look through this as sort of the lens of us in front of an Ofsted inspector, what they might ask us to provide. And where we can sort of source some of the information and some of the types of evidence that we could talk about. So remember that these are split into judgments of per provision. These are the first judgments that we're going to talk about. And then there's per programme as well. So they're going to want to talk to different people at different times. A key point to remember is that in Ofsted's eyes, everybody is a leader within that apprentice journey. So the first one is safeguarding. That's the judgment that we said that's binary. It's either met or not met. So the focus of this is around the culture of safety, the policies and responsibilities, the leadership and governance that we have around that, and also how safeguarding weaves itself into sort of the recruitment, but also the training of staff on this. So in terms of staff, we become really, really important evidence sources in this. As it says at the bottom, they're not going to ask you to quote the policy word for word, but they'll certainly ask you to identify where the policy is, but they might want to explore how an apprentice would raise a concern to you and what the mechanisms for that would be and how would you act. They might ask about safeguarding responsibilities. Are they clear in your role, and what would you do if a concern was raised to you? They might even ask for some examples that you've had around safeguarding concerns or fitness to practice, and what are the escalation routes that would go through this, and in terms of sort of the faculty and central safeguarding processes. They're going to ask around where safeguarding's taught as well in the curriculum. Obviously, we do different levels of safeguarding at different points, and they're going to want to talk about where it's mentioned in terms of in the inductions, program inductions, and where it features in education, and how learners are putting this into practice as well. Ultimately, what they want to know is that safeguarding of learners and staff and patients is embedded and sort of thought about in day-to-day practice. And other ways that we can demonstrate this is through the use of progress reviews and personal supervision to highlight well-being and sort of safeguarding issues. The next one is around inclusion, and this kind of threads its way through the full framework, and it's back to that quote of get it right for the most disadvantaged, we'll get it right for everybody. And that features heavily in a lot of these. It focuses around us as institutions and educators having high expectations, creating respectful environments, supporting diverse needs and inclusive culture. And again, staff in the institution become really, really powerful evidence sources of this, right through thinking about inclusive curriculum, to being inclusive in assessments and feedback, to being inclusive in terms of classroom teaching and how we adapt our teaching. So they might want to explore how inclusive behaviours are modelled in teaching and support that we do, and how we would make reasonable adjustments if a learner needed that, and what would the mechanisms be for that. Obviously, we have policies and codes of practice around that. They'd want to talk about the sort of the experience of fairness and consistency. They want to know that all of our learners have the same kind of opportunity in terms of inclusion. They're going to look for obviously inclusive practice there and some policy knowledge as well. So they certainly want to be able to talk to you about where are the policies located, how would you use things like reasonable adjustments in your lesson plans or in your teaching, additional considerations and how those are used, things like extensions. All of those things are super, super important, and things that we do, to support inclusion as well. Things like referral to support services where needed, mental health, also academic writing, and how we use suspensions and breaks in learning to enable students to come back and succeed as well. The next one, and this is the whole last of the sort of whole provider judgments, is around leadership and governance. So this looks at the strategic direction of the institution, the culture and values that we have, the oversight and accountability of the provision and how that works at programme level, how that works at school level, how that feeds up to faculty, and then how that feeds up to the institution. And so it's operational evidence here. It's about understanding the governance and escalation routes if we need them, how we identify risks and escalate those, and how we do that in partnership with employers as well. And that how we experience and manage quality improvements. So we normally do that through faculty committees of identifying improvements in self-assessments and quality improvement plans, and how we operationalise that. So this is super important, that staff are judged as leaders at all levels in terms of that apprentice's journey or that participant in skills boot camps, and our engagement with governance as well. They're not necessarily looking on who sits on what committees. They want to see that governance is working, risk is being identified, improvements are being made and highlighted and supported by clear governance. And this is how our provision contributes to the skill needs in terms of identifying skills priorities for the region, how employers are involved in our curriculum, and how responsive we are to change in the sort of employment or jobs markets, and how we adapt our curriculum and update it as well. So we become quite important evidence sources, but employers become particularly more powerful than us in this, but they might want to explore how programs sort of reflect the employer and service needs, and how employers feed into redesigning them, and how the feedback that they give feeds into changes within the curriculum, changes within the timetable, and benefits the students ultimately and the learners. And so inspectors, they sort of look for the relevance, the currency and the responsiveness of the curriculum, and how quickly we make changes. They're expecting to see how employers are involved in the governance and changing shape of your program, and how that what you're teaching still has relevance. And that forms the kind of the four institutional judgments, and of those we'll get an institutional mark for each of those, met or not met for safeguarding, and then on that sort of 5-point range for the rest of them. And then these next three fall into those provision ones. Curriculum, teaching and training kind of follows that quality of education one that we had before, where it's looking at curriculum design, it's looking at on-the-job training, and an assessment and progress and staff expertise, and that staff are expert in the area that they're teaching. Obviously, we become really valuable evidence sources in this, looking at how our teaching links to the occupational practice that they're doing. So the theory that they're doing at that moment in time, how are they putting that into practice when they're out in the workplace, out on the ward, and how the progress is being monitored, and how you're monitoring the progress of your learners and their starting points and their development. and how the feedback that you're providing, not just at summative assessments, but also feedback within progress reviews, feedback within personal supervision or academic supervision, how that's enabling somebody to succeed and complete their apprenticeship as well. And how we're preparing our apprentices for the endpoint assessments. So they're going to explore teaching and support as experienced by the apprentices. So going to ask about what our teaching's like and how they're putting that into practice. They're certainly going to do a lot of that triangulation as well. And they'll ask the employers as well about the theory that they're learning at the moment and how they're applying that as well. And the next one is achievement. So thinking about the learner outcomes, progress from starting points, closing any awarding gaps that we have, and the sustainability of achievement. So how is our provision geared to make constant high achievement sustainable? But they're going to want to explore how you support and engage the engagement, attendance and completion, and the standards around that and how we monitor that. They're going to want to talk about how we manage the academic workload and the academic burden and in balance with clinical placement and how we contract for that. They'll want to talk about how apprentices are supported through particular challenging times. And this goes back to that sort of inclusion section as well. What we do for apprentices who maybe have a moment in time, for example, they may be going through a particular challenging time in their academic study, and how we support them and still enable them to achieve. So they're not going to necessarily ask you to quote our achievement rates, but they'll ask you how you're supporting apprentices to achieve as program directors and as educators and leaders. And then the final judgment is about participation and development. And this is kind of a stretch judgment. It's looking again at attendance and engagement, but it's going towards that personal development, about them developing behaviours and values, but how we're providing extra opportunities for personal growth and careers advice and progression. Opportunities beyond the core curriculum, but we're providing these additional opportunities and providing activities that contribute to their professional growth. And they're going to want to talk to us about things about career and progression as well. Are we having conversations in introducing apprentices to career services and advice? But are we having those conversations with them in their sort of final year about where they want to go? Where do they want to go in 3 years? How could we enable them and support them to do that with services and advice? So this is here where they hear some of the sort of really rich examples of how staff go above and beyond in that participation and development domain. And we've got